Hello my dear friends and welcome to StudyIQ. I am Joy and today in this lecture we will discuss about the removal of 3 banks from the prompt corrective action framework of the RBI. So recently RBI has removed 3 banks, namely Bank of India, Bank of Maharashtra and Oriental Bank of Commerce from the prompt corrective action framework of the RBI. So prompt corrective action framework was a very important current affair, and there was also an ongoing tussle between government and the RBI regarding the prompt corrective action framework that was adopted by RBI. Now RBI has removed 3 banks from the PCA framework and we will discuss this in detail in this lecture. But before moving on to the lecture, let me tell you, if you are preparing for any competitive examination, whether it is SSC, bank examination or for UPSC or for any defense examination or railway examination, RBI grade B, NABARD, UGC NET, CLAT examination or any state PSCs, we have the pen drive courses of all these courses available. You can check our website www.studyiq.com for further details, or you can make a call to any of these numbers for more details. Now moving on with our topic. Let us first understand what is PCA or prompt corrective action. So I have already made a lecture on PCA or prompt corrective action which is available on the StudyIQ channel. There I have discussed PCA in detail. But here for your understanding I would be discussing PCA in brief. Now PCA or prompt corrective action is issued by the RBI. RBI is Reserve Bank of India, which is the apex monetary institution in the country. So what is the purpose of issuing PCA framework to banks by the RBI? This is to maintain the sound financial health of the banks. To maintain the financial health of the banks, RBI initiates certain structural or discretionary actions for banks under the PCA. Now, what are the parameters based on which RBI would be taking these structural or discretionary actions, or how RBI will put the banks under the PCA framework? So it is based on 3 important factors, or what we call as 3 important regulatory trigger points. The first one is capital to risk weighted assets ratio. The second one is the NPA or net non-performing assets, and the third one is ROA or return on assets. So these are the 3 important trigger points or regulatory trigger points considered by RBI when RBI put certain banks under the PCA framework. So the purpose of keeping the banks under the PCA framework is to help the banks to take corrective actions and to restore the financial health of the banks. So this is PCA, and coming to the detail of each criteria. The first one, capital to risk weighted assets ratio or capital adequacy ratio. So let us see what is capital adequacy ratio. It is a measurement of banks' available capital expressed as a percentage of banks' risk-weighted credit exposures. Now, every bank has to maintain a CAR or capital adequacy ratio of 9%, and if the CAR goes down or less than 9%, RBI would take corrective action or put the banks under the PCA framework. Second criteria is the NPA. Net NPA refers to net non-performing assets. So what is meant by a non-performing asset? A non-performing asset is a bank loan for which the principal amount or the interest is overdue for more than 90 days. So if the NPA of the banks rises above 10%, RBI will take a prompt corrective action against the bank. Now return on assets means the profitability of the bank. That means for the assets that is deployed by the bank, what is the return or what is the profit made by the assets. So if ROA is also lesser, RBI would take up a corrective action against the bank. And what happens when RBI initiates a prompt corrective action against a bank? The RBI will put certain restrictions on the banks. For example, they cannot issue fresh loans, or they cannot open new bank branches, or there will be restrictions on dividend distribution of the bank. So such type of restrictions will be put on the banks. That means there will be stricter norms for lending, branch expansion, management change, asset reduction. So depending on the financial health of the bank, RBI can take structural actions or discretionary actions. So discretionary actions means those actions which are applicable for a particular bank depending on the financial health of the bank. And RBI had put 11 public sector banks under the PCA framework when the bad loan situation in the banks got worsened, and also many of the public sector banks were showing a higher ratio of NPA or non-performing assets. So RBI had put 11 public sector banks under the PCA framework with different degrees of restrictions. That means depending on the financial health of the public sector banks, the restrictions put on these banks were different. And many of the rating agencies, for example Fitch, they had praised RBI for undertaking a prompt corrective action that will help the struggling banks to recover in order to take corrective actions. So it was praised by many of the rating agencies, but the government had criticized RBI for putting stricter regulations under the PCA framework. So government actually asked the RBI to relax the PCA norms in order to ensure more sanction of credit by the PSUs in order to increase the money supply. So when PCA or prompt corrective action is triggered, it means that the lending activities of the banks will come down. So lesser credit can be availed from such banks. So that will impact the money supply in the economy. So government had asked RBI in order to relax the PCA norms. And it also led to a tussle between RBI and the government, which we have already discussed in some previous lecture. Main reasons for the tussle: one was the PCA norms, second one was regarding the distribution of dividends of the RBI, and the third one was opening up a new window for the NBFCs. So these were the three important reasons on which there was a tussle between RBI and government. So now this is briefly about PCA or prompt corrective action framework of the RBI. Now let us understand what are the reasons RBI has brought 3 banks out of the PCA framework. So 11 public sector banks were put under the PCA framework, and recently 3 banks are moved out of the PCA framework. So these 3 banks are, one is the Bank of India, second one is the Bank of Maharashtra, and the third one is the Oriental Bank of Commerce. So these 3 banks were among the 11 public sector banks which were brought under the PCA framework by the RBI. So now these 3 banks have improved in their financial health, and that is why RBI has brought them out of the PCA framework. The first reason is the capital infusion by the government. So what is meant by capital infusion by the government? These banks are public sector undertakings. That means a majority of the share is held by the government, or the owner or the ownership rights of this banks is with the government. So as the owner of these banks, the government infused or injected capital into these banks in order to improve their financial health. And among these 3 banks, 2 banks particularly, that is Bank of India and Bank of Maharashtra, both of these banks achieved a lesser target of net NPA. So if net NPA goes beyond 10%, the banks will be put under the prompt corrective action network. So these 2 banks improved in terms of NPA or net NPA, and it reduced to 6%. So one major reason for this was the capital infusion by the government. The NPA of Bank of India came down to 5.87%, and Bank of Maharashtra it came down to 5.91%. And in case of Oriental Bank of Commerce, the NPA came down to 7.15%, which is less than the 10% cap which is set up by the RBI. So one major factor which had helped this bank to come out of this PCA was the capital infusion that was done by the government recently. Now another reason is that these 3 banks had now met the regulatory norms of the RBI, and one important regulatory norm was the capital conservation buffer norm. So now what is capital conservation buffer? This is a concept that is introduced in the Basel III norms. So what is the concept? It says that during good times, banks must build up a capital buffer. That means when the banks functioning or the performance of the banks are fairly good, the banks must keep a capital buffer. Buffer means excess or stock. And this buffer must be used by the banks when they are under stress or the financial health is low. And in India, the minimum capital requirement is 9%. So this is what we have discussed under CAR or capital adequacy ratio. So the minimum percentage in India is 9%, and the capital conservation buffer would be 2.5 percentage points over and above the minimum capital requirement. So 9% plus 2.5 percentage points. So this is capital conservation buffer. This comes under the Basel III norms, and this is an important regulatory norm that is undertaken or considered by the RBI while deciding the financial health of a bank. And coming to the second regulation, that is return on assets. So according to RBI, if a bank maintains a negative return on assets for 2 consecutive years, they will be put under the PCA framework. Now the RBI has taken a written statement from the lenders, that is these 3 banks, that they will increase on the return on assets, or they will bring up initiatives in order to comply with the norms of minimum regulatory capital, net NPA, and also the return on assets. So they have agreed that they will make certain structural and systemic improvements, and further government also agreed that the capital requirements of these banks will be factored. That means government will be infusing more capital into this public sector banks. So considering all these factors, now these 3 banks, Bank of India, Bank of Maharashtra and Oriental Bank of Commerce, are taken out of the PCA framework by the RBI, and even if they are taken out of the PCA framework, they are subjected to certain conditions, like they will comply with the norms and regulations, and also they will be put under continuous monitoring by the RBI. So if in any case the health comes down, or if they do not comply with the norms of the RBI, they will be again put under the PCA framework. So that is how these 3 banks have come out of the PCA framework by the RBI. This PCA framework, or Prompt Corrective Action Framework, is very important for your UPSC preliminary examination and also for your mains examination. And this topic is also very important for other competitive examinations like the RBI, bank examination, IBPS, SSC, state PSCs, etc. So this is a very important topic, very important current affair. You should have a clear understanding of this. And you can find the PDF of this lecture on my Facebook page. And for any queries regarding your preparations, you can get in touch with me on my Facebook page, or you can email me at joyce.studiiq@gmail.com. Thank you.